my lens on thinking about retention is you have to give people these days an opportunity that's bigger than money. When you're the HoldCo CEO, you can influence kind of the systems the business runs with. You can secondarily influence kind of the values and the level of excellence that you have. And then number three, you can influence through coaching. The best moment that I had kind of in that journey was when I went on like a 3-week vacation from running a business. And I came back and everything was running better without me.
The place I want to actually start today is I was listening to a few of your other podcast appearances before we started recording, and you said something interesting. You were talking about how there's sort of like ideas people and operating people, right? And I think in the world that I live in, there's like way more like idea people who are like, oh, if only we could just like find like operators to run this would just like work. And you made an interesting point. You said there are more of operators than idea people. Can you expand on that and sort of like contextualize that difference of like HoldCo CEO versus operator versus idea guy versus whatever?
Yeah. I think it's a true distinction, and I think that people who are in our world suffer from a level of selection bias, right? Where who do you gravitate to? A bunch of idea people that listen to podcasts and talk about ideas and stuff like that, right? And it's the same with like Twitter ends up with this echo chamber of people that are like, why would you ever want to work for somebody else? I'm an entrepreneur. It's like, well, actually, you're just hanging around the other 1% of people that are just like you. The 99% of people in this world are either happy taking a job or don't want to live where you live, like on the risk reward spectrum, right? You talk to them and they're like, why would I do that? That seems insane. The same way, like you talk to me and I'm like, why would I ever take a job? That seems insane. Well, it's because to some extent, like we're unique and there's a selection bias in the people we spend time with.
And you sort of went through that transition yourself where you switched from operating CEO to holding company CEO.
Right.
Can you talk about sort of what triggered that change and how that transition was before we sort of dive into like what is the HoldCo and everything else?
Sure. Well, the transition for me from operating CEO where you own and operate one business, like, and that's your baby. Like eventually I had a couple of realizations. One was I wasn't having that much fun. And it was mostly not fun because it didn't do the things that I liked. And one of the things I like is to hopefully perform like at a high level. And like performing poorly is not fun to me because I know what good is and I knew I wasn't good at it. And my problem was I had too many diverse interests and I liked change too much to be a great, OpCo CEO, right? Like you think about what your job is as an OpCo CEO, it's like 350 days a year of kind of boredom and mundane stuff, grinding out 0.5% improvements. To me, that seems really boring, right? That's just me. And then a few moments of abject terror that are actually very interesting because they're novel problems, right? And like I'm the wrong person to take a job like that. Like I actually want to be in a creative space. I want to be like seeing different stuff that's going on all the time. I want to be exposed to new things that are interesting. And like I started to realize I kind of sucked, and like I sucked, which was causing me not to have fun. And that's where I started to get on a journey to change that, to get to a role like I do today where I'm much happier.
And I want to ask you about that transition through the lens of engagement, just to reflect back what you said to make sure I understood it right. When you're operating a company, it's just sort of like the same thing over and over again. So you're not really feeling engaged. And when you mentioned abject terror, when there were like sort of like moments of turbulence, maybe you were like, oh, I can go be creative. Like I can go be fully engaged. So it's almost like your engagement was depending on the level of creativity that was required in the business.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I thrive in hard creative problems that are novel. Like one of the things I like to joke about is I can do anything once incredibly well. The second time is kind of, it's there. The third time I forget that I have to do it. Like that's a problem. That's not good. You don't want that in an operating company CEO. So at the time, I didn't really have the toolkit I have now to where I could have automated and systematized those things.
Mm-hmm.
But, trying to remember the 45 details that I need to stay on top of which 40 are not that interesting to me, like that was a problem for me as an operating company CEO.
One of the people I just interviewed was, I was mentioning to you before, Ayman Abdullah, who ran AppSumo. And he made a really great point where he was like, most companies should just have one product, and you can with one product scale to above 5 million, and then you should like look at like other products and doing more creative stuff, right? And I remember in the interview I was like, yep, we're going to do that. And then I'm thinking, I think I'm going to like after like the fourth or fifth client, I'm probably going to lose interest before we reach that like income level. Um, and then like when I came to this conversation, I was like, oh, I think what I should learn from Michael is when I'm growing to that, like scaling to that 5 million, I should bring in someone and operate it as a whole co. Does that sound right? Like the right way to think about it, or
Look, I think the HoldCo lens should be inverted for everybody. Like I
okay,
think the best way to figure out like how you want to drive your business is ultimately like what's in it for you. And at its core, the what's in it for you is what do you want to be spending your days working on, right? And so, I would invert that and not say, oh, here's the right thing to do it because there is no right or wrong. Like
hmm
getting a job, that's perfectly fine. Doing what I do, perfectly fine. Being a bum and sitting on your couch, like also perfectly fine. It's your life. You can totally do what you want to do. And you deciding, hey, like I'm going to get bored, I'm going to bring in an operator and replace myself, or I'm going to elevate myself. Like those are all perfectly fine answers. Like, because ultimately, like I think the lens you have to use to look at all this is what do you want your life to be? Because too many people get stuck, frankly, where they become the servant to their business and the business needs to serve them, right? And you'll see it a lot of times in how people actually treat their business. Like there's that book, Pay Yourself First. Have you heard of this book?
I haven't. No.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but the title's great. Anyway, but it's basically this idea that a lot of people let themselves become a servant to their business as opposed to the opposite, right? And I found myself doing this. And like the pay yourself first idea is like normally what people do when they have a business is they pay this vendor first, they pay this employee first, they pay that other person first. And a few years ago, as I started to think about this, I was like, wait, this is all screwed up. Like, this business should live to serve me, my family, and my goals, and not vice versa. So, like, some of these, like, pay yourself first ideas are like, okay, your first budget item is how much money you're going to make this year, right? Like, you're the business owner, you get paid first. And then we figure out all the rest after that. But most people invert that, right? They pay everybody else, pay the employees, they talk to the customers, they give discounts, and then they look up at the end of the year and see what's left over. Like the idea is that's totally backwards. And so anyway, that bringing that all the way back to your question, which is like what's right? Like they're all right. Nothing's
Mhm.
wrong. Like so I'm not going to tell you like do one of these things or do another one of those things. Like how do you want to be living your life when you have that $5 million your business? You could do what some of my friends do. They just stop working. Like it's totally fine too. Like none of us and me or any other guru is going to be the right one to tell you that one thing is better than another. Like do what's right for you and make sure the business is your servant instead of vice versa.
So can you describe through the lens of your story when you were operating in a company, why did you switch to a whole co model? And actually, even just define what it is for people. And then I'll share sort of like where I'm struggling with it.
Yeah, 100%. Um, yeah, I mean, for me, like I started to think about like what did I enjoy the most in terms of my day-to-day professional life and what did I envision that kind of life looking like for me? And, at the time I realized that the grinded out very important, very meaningful, like good, very valid life of owning a business, working your ass off in it, running it very well, and doing that grind of one business. Like that was a perfectly valid path, but it wasn't the person and the life like I wanted to live. And it took me a while to get there. Like I make this sound like it's pretty easy, but like at the time, there wasn't this idea of like what a holdco is or like a personal holdco, which is kind of is a great way to describe what I do, which is you end up having not just one business that you're very closely tied into and you lean into and comprises, a good upside for you, but you have multiple businesses that you're doing that where you lean in, usually from a board perspective, and you're not operating those businesses. So in my example, like I have going on a dozen businesses now where I would qualify them as meaningful bets, right? That I'm making into businesses where I have significant equity stake. And over time, those are compounding and growing. But I'm not actually in there running those businesses. There's
Mhm.
individual GMs or CEOs that are running those businesses, but I'm owning 5%, 30%, 70%, 100% of those businesses to where they're meaningful chunks and meaningful bets that, I'm using to build wealth over time.
So I'll share sort of like why I even reached out to you. I think I'm in that similar like point where I have to decide like how I want to build this, right? There's a few different things that we do. There's one side of what I do, which is like just like really like consulting with really like top end creators
Yeah.
and helping them grow their business or build a podcast or whatever. Within that, there's an option to like build like almost like a podcast studio. Then there's like training, which is like training creators. I think that's similar to like your coding bootcamp, creators MBA, which we can like turn into more of a training thing for creators, right?
Yep.
And I see all of these as potential like seven-figure businesses that could either be like in one or could be like independent. And I think when you were describing this sort of like living in the world of ideas and like not operating and just sort of like working with a team and having a GM, that sounds so ideal to me.
Yeah.
So is that sort of like the right elements for HoldCo, and what should I be thinking about here at this point?
Yeah. Well, so what makes a HoldCo for sure, like you need to have either geographically disparate or distinct customers amongst each thing. So like a business, I talk about something that has multiple products or multiple businesses, but they all sell to the same customers. That's not a HoldCo, right? That's just a business with multiple SKUs. That's
Mm-hmm.
ultimately what that is. So I think that's the first kind of question to ask in terms of, okay, is this a HoldCo? Is, okay, do I have different customers? And then if you have different customers, right, then you have the ability to go in and say, okay, well, I'm going to change my interaction model with this business, right? And this business's job is to take the capital I've deployed into it and then give me capital returns on it on an annual or semi-annual basis, wherever you want to get it, pay yourself first. And then you can say, okay, my interaction model there is I'm going to delegate to somebody else the actual operation of that business down to the strategy, from the tactics down to the strategy. And I'm going to let somebody else run that business as CEO. And I'm going to just reside, in a semi-passive or semi-active manner supporting that company. So in terms of your multiple lines of business, that's where I would ask, like, okay, well, are those businesses all targeting the same kind of customer base? And if they're not, then you potentially have a situation where you can create distinct businesses there, all owned by you, where there's a GM for the training business and there's a GM or a CEO for your consulting business and all that kind of thing in terms of going down that line.
It's definitely different customers in the sense of like how there's like Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy, right? Just
Yeah.
from like what level people are at or whatever. So in terms of that, it is different businesses.
Yeah. So that can work. I mean, I think there's also, when you start to get into the HoldCo model, where people often get tripped up is, okay, I'm going to own portions of all these businesses and all these different things. You need to ask yourself, okay, how much of that business is dependent upon your labor? And some businesses can't work that way in terms of being scalable. So, if your consulting business requires you to win over customers, right? Or your consulting business requires you to actually deliver the service, that becomes very difficult to scale beyond that. So most people who end up owning multiple businesses or HoldCo type things are trying to figure out ways to work themselves out of jobs all the time, because you can only really hire yourself once to run a business or work in a business. But you can definitely own multiple businesses very easily and scalably.
And I think that you sort of like hit on the nail on the head, which is the consulting is so tied to me, but
Yeah.
the training, I've wanted from the start build it so it isn't tied to me, because that's the only way it's one scalable. And I actually just had a conversation today with someone where they're talking about how you can actually sell course companies, which I think a lot of people didn't know you could do. And I think that's the only way it's sellable. So when I'm looking at that, what are some of the disadvantages and advantages of going the whole cost structure versus just like one company?
Yeah. What do you want to start? You want to start with the advantages? The advantages are much more fun.
Yeah,
So,
let's do that.
the advantages are kind of parallel compounding. They talk about serial entrepreneurship. I think HoldCo is really fun because it's parallel entrepreneurship. Like you can spin up businesses, you start them, you automate them, you keep them going, but you can do that in parallel, right? Whereas if you only own one business, like you're compounding one business at a time, that could be great. You just better hope that one business does really good because all your eggs are seriously in your basket. I think the other advantage is around lifestyle as well. I think you have a situation where if you want to do the types of things that like are sitting on boards and coaching and working only on really interesting problems, or what I would say is novel, really interesting big problems, hairy stuff, like that's also there as well. You have the ability to follow your creativity and really follow your curiosity. I think when you're involved in multiple businesses, like it's super cool. Like I can become somewhat of an expert in lots of different markets as opposed to just being in one if you're
Mhm.
owning an individual company. Um, Other stuff that's interesting, I think when you have a holdco and multiple like bets, you're more resilient potentially. Like you have a situation where you own multiple things, and it's unlikely that they're all going to go out of business at the same time, right? So those are a lot of the advantage. In the end, like I tell people considering it, like think first about what lifestyle you want to live, right? Because ultimately, the things that you do when you own multiple businesses and you're semi-passive or somewhat active in them, and we could talk about how that model works. But when you do that, I think you have a situation where like that creates a different lifestyle for you, and you have to decide if that's the life you want to live. I have friends that understand entirely what I do, and they totally get it. They could do it if they want to. They just don't want to, and that's totally fine.
Because they want to be the
So
operators.
they've just liked being the operator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're just like, no. I just run this one business. I make good money a year, and I have a house down at the coast, and it's great. Our coast, the Texas coast. It's not really a beach. It's kind of like a Gulf. It's the Gulf of Mexico. Um, downsides are probably pretty obvious, right? Like if you delegate the operation of a business to somebody else, which is the right way to do it in a holdco, that's an increased level of risk, right? You also have an increased level of kind of the idea of, you've heard of the fog of war. Are you familiar with that idea?
I'm not.
Okay, so the fog of war is basically kind of this idea that like when you're a general of running an army, like your data points are very limited. You don't know what's going on in the opposing general's lines or across the lines. And then you're getting all kinds of like crazy, stupid like data points that are just lunacy. And so like when I was running a business, I would get, feedback from the field or from customers, or different things would come in. And I eventually made a rule for myself. I just wasn't going to believe anything that I heard unless I heard it 3 times. So it could be like, somebody walking to be like, hey, so-and-so, like location's on fire, or like this is going on. I was like, yeah, whatever. It's like, then when I heard it the 3rd time, like I was like, okay, that's definitely true. So, that happens as you get more removed from the operation of a company. All that stuff that when you're the owner operator of a business, you start to lose that kind of just things you learn by osmosis, like just by being around and being in the meetings every day. Like there is a disconnect from where your money is going because you have an investment in this company and how it's getting pushed around. And there's a delay there and a fog of war where you don't see what's going on as much as you did when you were
Mm-hmm.
in there doing stuff. And that requires like a level of trust and faith in people, and also a faith in your own ability to supervise things when you have limited information. Like it becomes a very different level of difficulty to supervise a business that you're not working in every day. And some people just aren't comfortable with that, or they just don't want it. So that's definitely one of the challenges. There are risks if you set stuff up incorrectly that you could create a situation in which one domino falls and brings down your whole empire. It's rare, but I've seen people make stupid mistakes like that.
Can you give
Just
an
by
example?
Yeah. So, for example, in America, there is an idea where you may personally guarantee debt, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I've seen where debt has gotten out of control with people, and that could cause, say, if you have a bunch of personally guaranteed debt on one business, that could domino that where they would come after your other assets. So, you set yourself potentially up in a problem there. So, that's an example of how it can
This is
happen.
like the Twitter Tesla thing that Elon has done, kind of, right? Where he's
Pretty
like, you
much,
just
yeah.
want to guarantee the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah, so you're cross collateralized in that situation. So that's a way in which you could screw it up. Liability, if you don't do stuff right in terms of limiting liability, can be a problem as well. Those are all potential problems. It's rare, but like you can make dumb mistakes and end up with kind of that kind of situation. Um, other downsides of the whole co model. I talked about the potential for inefficiencies. Just in terms of you're not as close, so you can't run things as well as you do when you're very close to the business. You have to have board meetings and all that kind of overhead that happens.
You know what was interesting too, like, is as you were describing some of the challenges, I was just thinking to myself, like, there's also an element of both surrender and letting go.
Yeah,
Um, because you almost like it's like personal development. Otherwise, you're just gonna go back into the business, start like bull in the china shop, making changes, and then you're not doing what you're supposed to.
absolutely. I mean, when I first started doing what I was doing in terms of running things like a holdco, like I would like think that more of me was better, right? Like, and what I learned over time was the people that want to run these businesses and want these jobs that are CEO roles, like they have a mindset that they want to be running the business, right? And they
Hmm.
don't want me in there like second guessing them. And what I discovered was by simply showing up at meetings, like team meetings, weekly meetings, I ruined them. It was kind of like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You know that idea? Like you can either know which way a proton is spinning or you can know what its charge is. Like those are your two options. You can't know both, like something like that. But anyway, it was this idea that like by purely being there, like I would actually ruin the meeting. So it wasn't like I was there seeing what the real meeting was. It was because when I showed up, like I'm the boss's boss's boss, right? And I'm sitting through your team meeting and trying to
Hmm.
be helpful. It turns out I'm just a really bad CEO at that point because like everybody defers to the person at the top. So you have to unlearn a lot of what your native kind of natural reaction is to problems or situations or how to deal with stuff and like do that better to actually help the company. And sometimes that's just, hey, get the hell out of their way and leave them alone. And that's kind of great. As a lazy person, I think sometimes do less for more is like the best thing I could ever
Sounds
imagine as a
perfect.
good. I'm like, you want me to do nothing? I'm your guy. Like, just
Let's do
sign me up.
this.
Yeah.
Um, so what I'm thinking right now is like we were before we started recording, like we were talking about how you're doing a course and how you've structured that. And as I'm talking to you, I'm realizing it would be really good exercise to like sort of like run through the process with
Yeah, sure.
maybe the training thing as an example. So let's say I'm at a point where I'm like, okay, I have this thing called Creators MBA where we do education and courses. We've sold a few. There is demand. People are really like emailing us, being like, when are you launching again? And I want to run this as a whole co as like not something I'm operating.
Yeah.
Um, is this something you sort of like start designing from the start, or is it I have to get a certain revenue myself and then bring in someone, or how do you how do you like sort of like do the quick start for this?
There's no right or wrong way that people get into owning multiple businesses and running them as a holdco. So some people like, and I've done it both ways. Some people, for example, will start a company, run it, and then migrate their way out of it. I talk through in the course like how to do that and how I've learned how to do it. TLDR, the best thing to do is just hire a great person and rip off the band-aid.
Mhm.
Like I've tried the like slow transition thing and it just never works well. Like don't do it. So people do that where they'll start one company, run it, be the CEO of that, and then transition to a board role, as a chairperson. I've also done it where you start a company and from day one, you plan on never working in that business, right? You're just there helping, shaping, incubating it early on, with the idea of either early on you bring on a CEO or you hire somebody that can do what you need for that period of time and you bring in somebody. So for me, it really depends on what the opportunity is and what the business needs to be able to do that. But, in the case of the training stuff, I think you would want to dig in there and understand what is required to get it to a point where you're comfortable having it support somebody who can work full time and make that P&L their whole life, right? And make that strategy and all that kind of stuff their whole life. And you could do that a couple different ways. One is you can get the business to a size where the revenue supports it and you're comfortable hiring somebody. You also can come out of pocket. And I've done that before where I invest in the company and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to underwrite this person's salary for a period of time so that they can get on the right end of the risk
Mhm.
reward spectrum to do that. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. A lot of times, what I always like to do is start with like, okay, where do I want this thing to end up in 3 years or so? And then I work my way backwards to kind of the decisions I need to make now. And you could do it either way. In your case, I'd ask you, can you afford a CEO?
I think I could. Well, it depends on how much that would be.
There you go. Well, I also talk about how much they cost. So yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, with the CEOs, you're at the early stage able to do some pretty interesting stuff. Like the earlier a business is, the cheaper equity is for you to kind of throw around because you don't really know if this thing's going to turn into a real business or not
Mhm.
if you're incubating it. But ultimately, like the lens I give people to think about hiring CEOs is there isn't like a database of what like small company CEOs get paid. I mean, they're out there, but it could be anywhere from like 50,000 a year to 5 million a year. It just totally depends upon the situation and kind of what's going on, the vision of the business, current state, and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, like the lens is you're competing to hire a CEO versus all the other opportunities they have and all the components of what you're offering them from money, equity, phantom stock, if you're going to do something like that. Those are all options that you can use kind of as a playbook to combine with the unique experience you're going to give them, that can combine to make that more attractive than the other things on the market. Where sometimes, like some of these CEOs, especially if you're able to pay them in some equity at the start, like you can get a significant discount to what they could get on the open market because you're giving them such a unique experience and opportunity, inside the business.
That's fascinating. And I think in this case, like also, I'm pretty confident we could like pre-sell the course and basically use that to fund the first operations person or CEO to start building it with.
Like, that's what I've learned 1,000,000%. Like, when we first started our training company, before we put together any curriculum or anything like that, and it's a 60-person company now. Like, it's very, I consider it pretty successful. And but when we were first getting it off the ground, like, it was a relatively novel approach to education, and we didn't know if anybody wanted to buy it. And I had a long conversation with my co-founders, and they're like, "Okay, well, we'll start writing some curriculum." I was like, we don't know if anybody actually wants to buy this. So let me go sell it first. And I went and like sold it for 2 months. And I knew we could build it. So it wasn't like I was potentially going to screw people over. And also we didn't spend their money until like later on, until, we had built some stuff and delivered it. So I knew we could, worst case, we give them back their money. But like going out and selling stuff and to validate it, and then also using that to help fund development and do that kind of negative cash conversion cycle, like, super awesome. Highly recommend it. So, and my course, like, I've pre-sold the heck out of it. We talked about it in the early stuff. Like, I'm in the black already, not counting my time, building the course just from pre-sales. So there's product market fit here there that, has me pretty excited.
So let's say like, let's just keep going on this thread, which is, let's say you can pre-sell, you collect a certain amount of revenue. Then what you're doing is you're bringing in a CEO and identifying that person, and then you just start building it with them together. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's totally an option. That's a path to do. I like doing it that way. At this point, I don't want to sign up for another CEO job. Like, I've done it enough, but I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. I get much more joy out of coaching somebody else through the process and being their support system and asking them good questions and being the person they can call, that's on their side and aligned, because we have equity in the same thing, right? And we're aligned that way. But yeah, so, that's something you could definitely do. And I think it's kind of the beautiful way to scale entrepreneurship. I talked about this parallel entrepreneurship idea. It's like, you can only hire yourself once. So what if you want to work on 3 things at once? You want them all to turn out great. Well, that's an option. You just got to sell somebody to do it. So that's the hard part.
Yeah, and this is where I was going with this, because what's funny is, as you're describing this, I literally have the person in mind who would do this, and we're literally figuring out how we're going to work together. So this conversation is directly going to influence what we do there, which is great.
Yeah.
I remember talking to a friend of mine who worked at Vista Equity, and he said one of the most unique things about Vista is, which is like the hedge fund that owns a lot of SaaS companies, is they have a really great executive bench of people they can bring in to any company that they buy. Right. So in this sort of like personal HoldCo world, what have you learned about hiring top performers, and not just hiring them, but actually retaining them so that they're like still like happy and growing the business and don't leave?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's, my lens on thinking about retention is, you have to give people these days an opportunity that's bigger than money. And I think that tends to center around 2 things. Number one is like the things they get to do every day and the experiences they're getting. Like, are you helping them grow? And then the second thing is, like, I think so many managers, especially people my age, I'm Gen X, like, we grew up in the like, leave your personal stuff at home. And so many of like my friends still have a hard time getting out of that idea of seeing the people around them solely as professionals. And like, my lens in which I try to work with people is, how do I create a situation where I'm going to see you as a person and solve for that first instead of solving for money, right? And so like, those are kind of the lenses there that are above and beyond kind of the financial aspect of it. Because frankly, in this job market, somebody can always go find a higher paying job, period. Right. But how do you compete with that by competing in a way that's going to provide them a unique opportunity to grow and a unique way to be, right? And so I spend a lot of time leaning into those things. Like, every CEO that I work with, like, we're doing regular one-on-ones. Like, I'm spending a lot of time asking questions, coaching them, supporting them, like seeing them as people. Like, and it's not my natural thing to be like, how are your kids doing? And I genuinely do care. It's just that I'm not wired to think about it because of the generation that I'm in, right? And Gen X is totally different from boomers, by the way. At least Gen X is a little bit more the middle child in the whole generational thing. But
Mhm.
like, so that's my lens to look at that stuff. Like, I'm not gonna try to win based on paying you absolutely more. Now, do we need to pay you a super fair wage for what you deserve? Absolutely. And so that could come, paying somebody fair wages could come different ways. So one is a great way is, a good salary, right? Do you have a nice salary in terms of what's being paid? Do you create alignment around the bonus structure, right? So I did a thread on Twitter where I talked about the way I like to do bonuses with people is to structurally align things to me, right? And what do I care about? I care about growth and enterprise value of the company. How do I care about growth and what derives, growth of enterprise value of the company? That's increased profits balanced with increased growth, right? Those are the things together that you want to have a healthy, growing EV over time. And so those are the things where I try to create alignment around those things through that kind of bonus thing. And then sometimes, and it's not always a must, like, is there some sort of equity where a person's a partner in the business? And, that's not a universal thing where people own portions of the business, but it's a possibility. And it's just part of the toolbox as you're thinking about like recruiting this other person. Like it's the third kind of thing that you have at your disposal. Can they own part of the business? And when somebody owns 20% of your business or 50% of your business or 5% of your business, it's a meaningful part of their net worth. It's pretty easy to do retention then because they're in the same bucket as you. They don't want it to go to zero.
I can see like how like so like combination of equity and profit share would keep someone aligned. Um,
But
I bet it's
I don't
really hard to.
look. Let's be realistic. If you're doing your job right as a HoldCo CEO, you're not keeping them in line. Like you want to hire people who are going to keep you in line. Like I routinely am okay being managed by
Yeah,
them
what
or
do you mean
told.
by that?
So normally people have this idea that when you own a business, the ideal outcome is you are somebody that, as the chairman or whatever, is giving the vision
Yep,
or telling people
that's
like,
what I had in my mind as a mental model. Yes.
I think that's exactly backwards. I think it's exactly backwards. Like, like if you want your team to take an entrepreneurial ownership of the thing, do you think they're really going to give a shit about your vision for the business? Like,
Then they're not being independent thinkers. Then that's right.
no. Yeah, if you want somebody to truly believe in a cause, the best way to do that is for that cause to be their idea, right? And then you mutually agree that this is all going to work, right? So like it's actually backwards for the chairman to walk in there and be like, I am here for 4 board meetings a year and I've got this all figured out. And I'm going to tell you, based on all I've seen, this is our vision for what we're doing. You can go in there and do some other stuff. But ultimately, you're much better off if the team comes to you and says, we've done an analysis of the market. We're watching which ways they're going. We understand your parameter as an owner and our needs as employees and the team here as well and all of our customers. And we think the best place we go is we're going to go to this place a decade from now. And this is the business we're going to have. Does that align with your interests? What do you think? Can we approve that? Yes. That's the way to have somebody feel like they're on an inspiring mission. Not for me, some jackass from San Antonio walking in there being like, hey, like we got it all figured out. Like I spent 45 minutes thinking about your business. And like I've got the whole vision figured out. You do things right and you have the CEO driving and managing you as a board and taking real entrepreneurial ownership of it. That is so much more powerful than some rando who is up on high coming up with that kind of stuff.
It's almost like sort of like you're helping them edit what they've created instead of writing it for them.
1,000,000%.
Uh,
Now I think I think I don't want people to misunderstand this. There are things that you have to do as an owner, right? Like I think the higher you get up in an organization, especially on the equity side, the more it's your job to manage things that are the meta around performance goals and the meta around performance. So for example, like one of the lenses I have is like a lot of my job is just maintaining very high standards. That's it. Just saying we're going to have really high. This is a culture of excellence, or we're not going to go chase that like quick buck, right? Because what we really want to build here is X, Y, Z, right? And so one of the examples is our coding business, the coding school, CodeUp. They have they have basically 100% tuition refund guarantee. Like we started doing this before anybody else. We realized we were in the help you get a job business, and
Mhm.
that was going to help you change your life. That's our mission. That's the why of what we do. And that's the job to be done kind of idea. You familiar with the jobs to be done idea?
Yes, jobs to be done framework.
Okay. So it's like, that's the job to be done here. It's not teach you coding.
Right.
It's we're going to help you. We're going to be Yoda to help you change your life. And so the North Star for that is, okay, like we're going to have 100% tuition refund guarantee if we don't get you a job, which helps you change your life. Right. And so that North Star there, like there were times where like we had a potential situation where like some regulators were going to make us stop doing that. Like they weren't going to let us give customers their money back because they felt like it would hurt, I don't know, something. So that was a regulatory thing. And I was like, nope, we're either doing that or we're going to shut down the company. Like those are the two options. You could just tell them that's how we're going to do it. So there's that high level of standards in terms of what our core value is and what kind of business we're going to build. But like, it's very rare that I do that. But the 2 or 3 times a year or every couple of years, like that's part of that high standards thing where it's like, okay, we're all agreeing what the sandbox is, and you guys need to tell me what kind of castle we're going to build inside of it, and then we'll help you, collaborate on taking that to the next level if we need to. But otherwise, generally, they're telling me what they're going to do.
I'm sure it's not trivial to find these kind of CEOs. So can you describe your process for hiring these and finding and hiring these CEOs, maybe with a few examples of companies that you
Yeah,
run?
I mean, there's a great, a great situation where like you're kind of incubating a business at this point, like bringing on a partner who wants to be the owner, a co-owner operator is something you can do very early, right? And that helps you de-risk the business a little bit because you almost get more of a co-founder in that situation, though you're usually putting in, capital to make that work. So that's an option. For me personally, I actually, and I guess this is a theme, like I invert it. And a lot of times I am building a roster of people kind of like Vista does, but
Mhm.
they're just people I run across. Where like last week I got introduced to a guy who's, has been a COO, GM for a number of telecom businesses backed by PE, decided to move back here to San Antonio. And I was like, okay, cool. Mental Rolodex. Got it. Like there'll be a moment where I call that dude. Like he seems pretty smart.
Mhm.
So a lot of times I'm inverting where I'm starting with talent because it's actually harder to find talent than it is to find at the very earliest stage. It's harder to find talent than it is to potentially find deals. And I know everybody complains about trying to find deals is hard, but finding talent is a lot of times harder. So at that very earliest stage, like they can become as a co-founder or somebody like there. And that could be a good model there. It is easier to recruit somebody as a co-founder than it is like kind of your stage. That's how I would kind of think about them. Than it is just to be a hired gun when there's not really a there, right? But as a business gets bigger, say if you're bringing on hiring a CEO for a 5 million or a 10 million or $20 million a year revenue business, it's totally doable to just run a process and hire a CEO for that business. And it's fascinating because there are orders of magnitude more people that want that job than there are jobs for a small business CEO. Because most people run their small business like, oh, I'm going to own and operate my trucking company. Like they never even imagine hiring a CEO for it. This is a relatively new thing where small businesses like this have a professional CEO. But you just run a normal process. And, my process is I go hard, like I go put it out everywhere. I write a job description for it. I write a good job description that's compelling for somebody that wants those kind of things. And then I look at the candidates that come in. Me personally, the way I like to do stuff is I don't like to hire the like tried and true old gray hair, been there, done it CEO type with a bunch of bad habits.
Mhm.
A, they're going to want to be paid like crazy. B, they typically don't like to work very hard. And C, they don't have much to prove. Like I would much rather go hire somebody who is what I call a cusper. When a cusper is somebody who is just about ready for the job, but has to stretch to get there. And so I've done things like hire somebody from an entirely different industry and just be like, okay, well, like you seem like you have a track record of success in this other industry. So I'm going to give you a chance to learn all about this one. And that stuff, has worked out generally pretty well. Hire for, as the Silicon Valley guys call it, you hire for slope rather than intercept. Have you heard that kind of quote?
I
Yeah.
I feel like I haven't heard that. I've heard the invest in lines, not dots. I know that's similar.
So there's two different ideas.
Okay.
So invest in lines, not dots, is like, you're looking for trends.
Mhm.
So, that's why like a lot of VCs are like, I want to have 4 meetings before I give you money. It's like they made up their mind in the first meeting. Let's be real.
Right.
Like you either pattern matched or you didn't. But anyway, we can go into VCs.
See, exactly what I was thinking.
You can go to VCs if you want later. But yeah, so slope versus intercept is like this is another typical nerd thing. Like, let's make a more complicated way of describing something very simple. Like, do you want to hire for potential and trajectory of where they're going to be? Or do you want to hire for like what somebody's capabilities are today? Right. And, when you hire for somebody's capabilities where they are today, generally you're going to be hiring them close to their ceiling, right? Because they've done it before, they did their best. So maybe that's the lines, not dots idea. But anyway, that's how I think about it. I would rather hire somebody that's going to be a 70% chance of being a 10x person than somebody that is a 100% chance of being a 2x person.
And that's exactly the person I'm talking to. The person who introduced me actually said something really interesting. They were like, this person is one of the fastest learners I know. And I went back, I was like, wait, do you mean fast or fastest?
Right.
Because they're very different things. And he's like, nope, fastest. I was like, cool, this is interesting. So
one of the things very important to that, and this is also something I do that's maybe counter to the way most people do it, is back in the 50s and 60s, quantifying the person through assessments and all that kind of stuff, it went into vogue and it went way out of vogue. Like it suddenly became not cool to give somebody like a cognitive ability test. And I have come back to really appreciating kind of just the ability for somebody to take in, process information and be quick on the draw, so to speak, in terms of processing ability. As a very selfish person, I learned I liked spending time with those people much more. I hated explaining stuff 3 different times. Like I wanted people who were just quick. So that's what I do now, actually. I'm very cognizant of, through my hiring process, I will screen out people, even at executive level, based on a cognitive assessment. And I use like one of the off-the-shelf ones. And by the way, Vista does too. If my hiring process involves cognitive and personality assessments, guess who else does that? Vista does. So you've talked about Vista, like that's where I got the idea.
Are there specific tests that you're using, and even like questions you're asking that person to make sure they're a good fit?
So 3 core systems, in my hiring process. By the way, you can find all this on a Twitter thread. I give everything away for free. So three core systems that I use that are all off the shelf. So number 1, I use a cognitive assessment, and that comes from a company called Criteria Corporation. That costs like $1,200 a year. They have a whole battery of assessments you can use, everything from typing to basically, they call the one I use CCAT, and it's kind of a Wonderlic style SAT timed thing. So, so that's number 1. Number 2, I love to use a personality trait assessment tool, and that's basically, it goes through and it's basically think of DISC, but it is done on a scientific basis. So DISC and Myers-Briggs and all that stuff, like the concept is great, but none of them actually have any real science behind them. So there are 2 tools that I recommend the most. It's kind of like astrology. Well, do you know how Myers-Briggs came around? You know where the name Myers-Briggs came around?
I don't, but is it astrology related?
So it's close. So Myers and Briggs were a mother-daughter team who back in the 20s in the United States, it became very vogue to get into astrology and personality assessments. Like this was like very big across the United States. And they invented Myers-Briggs personality assessment from their living room based on their experience meeting people. That's how it all came about. There's a fascinating book about how all these personality assessments came about. And when you understand that Myers-Briggs was designed by Myers and her daughter, Mrs. Briggs, and started to sell this thing, like you start to see how it's kind of bullshit. So anyway, the 2 tools I really recommend are use those same ideas as Myers-Briggs and DISC, but they're scientific based. So the one I use a lot is called Culture Index. There's another one that looks just like it called Predictive Index. They basically do the same thing. They ask you to tell me adjectives that you think describe yourself, and then it builds a model of your personality traits. And not that anyone is right or wrong, but it tells me how you're wired and what you're interested in. And I can trace back like all of my behavioral quirks and the things I do to that model of personality that comes out of that. So it's interesting. I have colleagues that originally started being like, I don't believe that at all. I'm not going to use that thing. And then like 2 years later, they're like, this is like a cheat code, dude. Like, like all these people, they were just faking it. And now they're like, now I find the job that's right for a person. And the cool thing about, I think, a personality assessment tool like that is you have a situation where there's no right or wrong. Like the cognitive thing, if you score 0 on the cognitive thing, I have bad news for you. You didn't do very well on the cognitive thing. But like on the personality assessment, there's actually no right or wrong answer. There's just right or wrong rules for how people are wired.
Right.
You don't send somebody who hates rules and wants to live in a creative space to be an accountant. It's the worst job ever, right? And so it was interesting when I went through the sales process for the personality assessment tool. The guy looked at my graph and he goes, Mr. Girdley. By the way, I'm at an age that people call me Mr. Girdley, unfortunately. Mr. Girdley, I have great news for you. I'm going to pay you $5 million a year. I was like, that sounds great. And I'm like, I'll take the job. What is it? And guy goes, your job will be to sit in a room, following rules, optimizing spreadsheets for audits. I'm like, that sounds terrible. Like I have no interest in. So you start to see like, could I do that? Yeah. After a while, would I try to kill myself? Absolutely. Because like that's the worst possible job I could do. So culture index and predictive index, those are 2 tools that I recommend to people. They're not cheap at all. You're going to pay somewhere between 8 and 10,000 a year for a tiny business to use them. But, their argument would be, which I think is pretty right. How much does a bad hire cost you? Is it worth it to do that? So, so we use that everywhere. And then the third system we use for interviewing is a system called Top Grading, which is all in a book from like 2003. And I actually had the guy that wrote it on my podcast. He was pretty awesome. It's like in his 70s. And his name's Dr. Brad Smart, which is kind of a cool name if you're going to be an author. But basically, Top Grading is a whole interview methodology that takes a lot of the common ideas that people have about interviewing and it inverts them. You'll notice a pattern here. I'm a natural contrarian. So it inverts all of those things and makes a lot of those ideas that we get wrong about hiring and flips them on their head. So super cool.
I love, first of all, the specificity with which you're answering all of these. The example that you described with the operations thing, I was thinking that too. I was like, if I was in that scenario and the guy was like 5 million for op stuff, I would never do it, right? Because you're and like you said, like you're not looking for right or wrong, you're looking for fit.
Absolutely.
Do you have examples of maybe like where like someone was in a role in one of your companies, not the right fit? You did one of these tests, shifted them around, and they just sort of like flew. Or how like you use the test to influence what the right role would be for a person versus the wrong role.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's this interesting dynamic in a lot of hard charging companies where you'll see that there'll be a hard charging CEO, COO, like very driven type folks. And kind of what happens with a very driven leader? Have you experienced somebody like that in the past? What happens to their staff?
Burnout.
They can get burnt out, or somebody needs to come along and, as my buddy calls it, the boogers and tears problem, right? Like they'll be just like, they just don't, they don't let feelings get in the way of the mission, right? And there ends up being a lot of times in these companies, especially the successful ones, if you'll see a very hard driving CEO, there could be typically somebody on their staff who's actually running around doing a lot of that, like social lubricating and smoothing stuff out behind them, right? And so you'll see it. For example, they're usually very good people, and they get along with everybody. And routinely, I've been able to identify who those people are going to be, who can run around and like clean up behind the messes that the CEO leaves without the shit blowing up. So that's a great example of like, if you know that person's there, you can put them in the right role to kind of do that stuff. Similarly, there's a personality profile that's really good at working on whatever the biggest unique challenge is in the company, like kind of strategic type stuff. And then 9 months later, they're going to be bored, invariably. And you have to move them on to the next thing. They're like a professional smoke jumper. So you wouldn't know that talking to the person. Because if you just know them, you think they're like very personable. But when you see their personality profile, you can be like, oh, this is how this person's going to work great. Because if I leave them in the same thing for too long, they're going to get bored and they're going to consider quitting. So I actually need to just let them go focus on one thing, go fix that thing, go smoke jump that thing like a firefighter, and then come back. So you can kind of create those roles that I think really, in my mind, are the greatest gift you can give to anybody, which is like, how do I find and craft the perfect role and situation for you as an employee or a team member to where you'll feel like it's not even work at all? And like,
Mhm.
that's the most powerful. And it's a beautiful thing when you can do that as a boss, because you're just like, man, like you're just like a Stradivarius violin being played in the situation. Whereas if I put you in something else, like you're like one of those like Tonka toy, like drum kits, right? Like how do I help you find that place where you're just going to be playing your absolute best music just because that's how you're wired?
I love that because you're like basically like helping people find their zone of genius.
Yeah.
Going back to what you were saying initially, sort of like you're separating yourself as the HoldCo CEO from the company CEO because you don't want to like step on their toes. How do you actually implement this in terms of making sure people find their zone of genius when you're one or two orders of magnitude, like or whatever levels removed from the person?
Yeah. I mean, there's a combination of things that happen when you're the Holdco CEO there. You can influence, I think three different ways. So number one, you can influence kind of the systems the business runs with. You can secondarily influence kind of the values and the level of excellence that you have. And then number three, you can influence through coaching. So let's talk through each one of those. So
Yep.
systems wise, like I've learned the easiest way for me to operate
And
is
by
to
the way,
stand.
really quick, if you can share examples of each of those, that would be very helpful
Oh,
too.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like number one, so influencing through systems becomes really powerful for me because I've gone through and said, okay, like everybody needs to use this mode of hiring or everybody needs to use this particular thing. So like in the case of how business strategy gets done, I've gone through with everybody and said, okay, we're using this business operating system, this system here. And the one we use is called EOS. It's You can learn
Traction.
it out of a book called Traction. Yeah. I tweeted about that the other day. Also on LinkedIn because, I'm a LinkedIn influencer now. I don't even know what that means. but it's
I
that
don't think anyone knows what that means anymore.
well, I mean, I'm kind of enjoying like that's part of the fun. I think when I'm like, sometimes I'll write a tweet like, because I'm a social media influencer now, I have to shill you my course. So anyway, all pretty fun stuff to kind of joke about that. So like, for example, like using the EOS system, you go into an individual company, you say, okay, everything I'm involved in is going to be using the same system. I'm happy to change it. We can use a different system if you want. But you need to convince me it's better than this one, and I'll change everybody else over too. We're going to pick one and we're going to use that one.
Mhm.
So what that does, for example, like EOS is very powerful because it has like a one-page front and back strategic planning exercise that you do, like business paint by numbers, basically. And so for me, that's super powerful because if everybody's using the same common language, I could be in a situation where I could just look very quickly and understand, okay, what's your 10-year vision? Like, what's your unique value proposition to the market? Like, where are you going to be in 3 years? How are you doing goal setting? All that kind of stuff. Like, all that stuff becomes very powerful for me and makes my job very easy in terms of interacting with these companies. And
Mhm.
so I can also influence them to run the system. And I know like they're going to have the type of discussions with me that I want them to have if they're going to run that system correctly. So that's kind of how you can influence stuff via systems. Um, so I talked to number two kind of about this kind of values and an ethics kind of approach to stuff. Like, I think in a situation I talked about before, like where the regulator was talking about not allowing us to do our brand guarantee, right? Where we're going to give people back their money if they didn't get a job, like that was like, whoa, hey, like core value, like we're not going to do that, like not cool.
Mhm.
Like we're going to shut down the company because that's how important that is. And, I think like there's also, values where um, it's also like how you react to those things. And that's kind of the third bucket of like coaching and the interactions. And like, so for example, we had a situation at one of our companies where a man in his early 40s, he had a stroke. And he'd been working with us for a few years. And so, it was really important to us to keep him taken care of, right? Who cares about the money? Like, how do we take about you first? And like, I don't know if you've dealt with somebody who's had multiple strokes in their early 40s. Like, it's a mess. Like, he
Hmm.
could barely talk, he could barely walk. And my brother and I, we said, look, the more than anything, what values is the people involved in all this. And like, we were very intentional about leaving him on our payroll for almost a year. We paid him almost a year's salary just because we wanted that kind of, coaching and influence to happen to where we wanted to send a message about what's really important here. And it's not our bottom line or pocketbook. And I think there's a lot of people that would have sent a different message. And, we wanted to send one that was very different. So that's that kind of coaching and interaction model type thing where like you get to influence that stuff as well. Very rarely am I in a situation where I'm just like, this is how it's going to be and this is how we're going to do it. It happens a couple times a year. And that's fine. But, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm doing it too much as a old co-owner.
What I hear in that too is again that sort of like idea for you're not being the bull in the china shop, going into the business and just like changing everything or whatever. You're really sort of stepping outside of it and looking at what are the different elements of the business that you can change. Um,
Yeah.
which is very different from like being like a company CEO, right? So I think it's probably pretty jarring when you make that switch. How would you differentiate the day to day between like an operating CEO versus like a whole CEO?
Yeah. Like everything you do inverts basically when you go from OpCo to HoldCo CEO. Like think about what happens right now in your business if there's like a problem, like you get ransomware. Like
I'm on it.
what do you
Yeah.
do? Yeah, you're on it. Like when
Yeah.
you're a HoldCo CEO, you know what your response is? Man, that sounds terrible. What are you going to do about it? How can I help? How can I help you? What do you want to do about it? Right. And so, very rarely am I going in there unless obviously if the building's on fire, like I'm going to lean in and do stuff. And that's what you have to do. But that's very rare. Right. Invariably, what you're going to see is problems get escalated to you when you're running a holdco, and you're passive in a business. You have to trust and then default to the opposite of your instinct when you're an operating company CEO. You don't lean into it. You actually stand by and say, okay, I'm part of your team. What do you need me to do? How can I help? And sometimes they just say, just stay out of the way. I just need you to know about this. So that radically kind of shifts that stuff. I think we talked before about the things that shift in terms of how close you are to things, what kind of decisions you get to make. There are times when the OpCo CEO makes decisions that I probably would not make that way
Hmm.
if I was doing it. Here's the little secret about it. Most of the time they were right. But that's if you hire good people, right?
Hmm.
So if you have good people and the right person in the seat, they're gonna have a better hit rate than you, which may be jarring to people who are like, I'm really good at business. Well, it turns out like you with limited information and partial focus is not better than somebody else. And this other person is likely, if you hire the right people, this other person is likely going to be better at running the business, even if you had full information and full focus. If you hire the right person for that situation, they're potentially going to be better than you. That's what I've seen. If you look at all of my significant positions right now, the people running those companies are now doing those businesses better than I could.
I think again, it's like what I hear in that story is like sort of this idea of like not having an ego about it, right? And I think of like I'm like 11 or 12 years in business, and
Yeah,
I think 3 or 4 years ago, if you had asked me like what I know, I would have been like I know everything because I'm like 6 or 7 years in. And when you hit like 10 years, you realize you actually don't know anything because the stuff that you don't know is so much.
yeah,
Um, did you sort of like have that sort of like personal evolution yourself, where you went from oh I have to know everything to oh it's okay if I don't know everything, and that's actually the better way of operating.
yeah. I mean, the best moment that I had kind of in that journey was when I went on like a 3-week vacation from running a business, and I came back and everything was running better without me. I was like, wait a second. What's going on here? Like objectively things just went better when I was like, oh, I should just trust these people and let the great people do their jobs. So, that was an evolution of stuff. And look, I think I'm 47 now. I think there is a level of it's easy for me to say, yeah, just identify what you're not very good at, just like don't do
Hmm.
that. It's but that's hard, right? When you're 30 or 40 or 35, your sample size is much more limited than mine. Like my sample size is, I've got almost 30 years in business.
Right.
Like, of course, like I have more data points about what I like and don't like and who I like working with and who I don't like working with. And it's just it's a different thing where I don't want to be that like older person that's like, oh, this is so easy. Like, yeah, you just do it that way. And it's, I hear it all the time from like these older, like rich, like successful people are like, yeah, failure is fine. It's like, no, it's not. It's not fine. It's not fine to some 28-year-old. You want to know why? Because 28-year-old does not have 25 years of business success, right? And they haven't had W's, right? So for me at this stage in life, if I have some L's, it's like, I had some L's, whatever. But like it just pisses me off when some 65-year-old is like, yeah, just go out there and just do it. And it's like, well, no, like these people are scared of failing because that is a lot of failure to them, because they haven't had any W's. So anyway, I don't want to be that guy that's like, yeah, just do the stuff you're bad at. I think the optimal journey is eventually you end up in this egoless situation where I'll tell you right now, like you give me a contract longer than 10 pages, I got to find somebody else to read that thing or a lot of coffee to like go through and like say this. I was like, because I just don't have it in me. Like, it's just not how I'm wired. But you want me to look at a very complex situation with a bunch of indeterminate information and pretty quickly give you what we should do right now? Yeah, I'm pretty good at that. So I'm good at stuff and I'm bad at stuff. And I try to do less of what I'm bad at.
Yeah, and I think a lot of like creative people don't usually like the contract stuff and the accounting stuff. Let's say like you're operating a HoldCo and you have like two separate companies and you've learned all of this about yourself. What does the operations of HoldCo actually look like?
Yeah, so there's different flavors of holdcos, and I talk about that a bit in the course. There's different flavors of holdcos that match kind of the assets you're going to be holding, right? So at one end of the spectrum, you could have something that looks a lot like Berkshire Hathaway, so Warren Buffett's company. That's kind of the holdco most people know.
Mhm.
I refer to that as a pure holdco, and that's just a set of heterogeneous things or businesses that are all independent. They have no shared services, and there's typically a very light headquarters staff. So I think last I saw, Berkshire Hathaway's worth $500 billion or something. They have 28 people in Omaha, like just very limited, right?
Mhm.
So that's kind of one thing where sometimes you just have your headquarters staff whose sole job is just capital allocation and preparing financial reports. That's all they do. So that can be a pretty simple situation. If you look at the way I do stuff, I have a disparate set of things. I have basically no staff whatsoever. I do have a chief of staff that started a couple weeks ago who's like helping me be less terrible. And then, that creates kind of a situation where you can have a very light situation where mostly my job is those things that I talked about, kind of looking for new deals, looking for opportunities, trying to put those together, supporting the CEOs, and then being part of the kind of supervisory process of that stuff. And that's generally how I spend most of my time working with companies and that sort of situation. So that can work well in a pure holdco. And then there are other models where there's more centralized services. So one of the things, if you want to, is you can build a holdco and say in your case, you could have a centralized accounting and HR function, and you have these different business units that all kind of centralize those things. And there's different types of things that work, different types of asset types that work better in those type things. And I talk a bit in the course about the different types of those type of entities. One's called a platform and the other one's called accumulators. And you see some of those and we go through those examples of kind of how they work. But in those situations in which there's more centralization, your HoldCo CEO will be much more operational than, say, in the Warren Buffett style, where he's just like sitting around waiting to see what he should buy next and then collecting his P&Ls when they get sent in from their companies.
So in the second one, the HoldCo CEOs, when you said like more operational, you mean they're doing more of the running of the company, less of the vision, or something else?
There is more stuff happening in the headquarters that they have to supervise and run. So, for example, if you decide, let's say in your holdco, you're building 5 different businesses and you want to have centralized sales, right? Or centralized
Mhm.
marketing, then that falls on the holdco CEO to provide that service, right? She will supervise that and you'll have more centralized stuff. So as you start to get into this situation where you go to these different models, you potentially have a holdco situation where the holdco CEO, instead of being 100% allocator and 0% operational, could be 50-50, for example. And those are all kinds of models that you can decide what kind of company you want to build. There's no right or wrong.
In most cases, are you always incubating companies, or maybe in other cases you're taking a percentage of companies? So, for example, like here's what I'm thinking about, right? Which is we have all of these services that we use, like video production and stuff. And I realized at some point that whenever I hire a company, we're actually like working with them to improve their processes, change their IP, and like how to do things. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay, either we need to have this in house, or I need to have a part of this company. So is that where like your whole co would basically take a part of their company and that becomes one of the companies within your whole?
I mean, that would be definitely a possibility. I mean, you just start with where you see an opportunity to go build something inside of your portfolio of assets, and does that align with kind of your vision of where you want to go? And in the course, man, I feel like such a guru. Like, let me tell you about my course, but like, I built this course because I like got so sick of like everybody asking me the same 12
Yep.
questions. I was like, I'm gonna record all the answers. But I think the lens there to look at it, and I walk people through it, is you pick a long-term vision of what you want your personal life to be, and then you build the business around
Mhm.
what you want in terms of that. And so you have to figure out what that vision for yourself and that life you want to have is, and then you say, okay, well, you know, what sort of portfolio do I need to start to build to reach that kind of goal? And in your case, like if you see an opportunity to build a business that matches the lifestyle you want and the vision you have for yourself, where you could go say, okay, hey, like I'm spending this much money on video production, but they're doing it all wrong. And I think I could do better by building a business around that and having that, strategically synergize with my existing businesses. Like that's a totally fine thing to do. There's no single path kind of to get there, but it all ties back to this idea of not like what's the opportunity in front of me. It's like how do the opportunities in front of me tie to where like I want to go in terms of your future vision for yourself and kind of your life and stuff.
The other thing I'm also thinking is we're sort of like changing my mind on is if you think of like levels of abstraction, you can almost change the business model you engage with someone in based on this. For example, a lot of creators that we talk to, right, are sort of like stuck at their like 200 or 300,000 mark and don't know how to scale. And so my
Yeah.
first instinct was we should create a course on operations and on like how to operate a creator business and sell that, right? And now what I'm realizing is, oh, maybe that is one option, but the other option is to almost like set up a holdco that comes in and operates these businesses. And to do that, we could take a percentage of their businesses, those businesses, and that becomes like a holding company of different creator businesses,
Yeah.
where the head offices are basically like helping operate them. And
Yep.
it would make way more as a business.
Yeah, and there's some parallel models to that. Like if you look at like physical therapy practices, have you heard of this thing called an MSO? I forgot exactly what that
I
stands for,
haven't.
but so basically the idea is like physical therapy, there's these things called MSOs. And basically what they do is they go in and they abstract out a lot of the stuff around the running of the business of being a physical therapist, right? So physical therapists are kind of like dentists. They're expected to be these folks who are basically like technicians, right? They have PhDs in physical therapy, but then they're also supposed to be like billing managers and facilities managers and staff managers, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of what has happened is people have centralized that kind of like a PEO does for your staff,
Mhm.
right? You're familiar with that idea. So imagine a PEO, but instead of just doing staff, what it does is it does like all your back office stuff. And it probably does some other stuff as well, like coaching and personal development, and then also potentially does things um, around kind of collective marketing and billing and negotiation, all that kind of stuff. So it centralizes all that stuff for a lot of these folks. And it basically becomes just like the business in a box situation for them. So, I mean, it seems like a good idea. Like, I like it. I mean, Work Week and some of those other guys are trying different models around that. But I like that much better than just selling somebody a course, just because like courses are cool, but recurring revenue is much better.
And it's also like the upside can be so asymmetric, right? Like for example, I've coached creators on growing their business,
Yeah.
and I've charged the same amount, but the like someone maybe like adds like $1,000 to their business or tens of thousands, but then I've had people who like paid 2,000 or 3,000 and they added like
Right.
hundreds of thousands to the business. I was like, should have gone with a different model over there, maybe.
Totally. Yeah. Like you get $2,000 no matter what. It's very not asymmetric. It's asymmetric for them.
Yeah. And one thing I'm also thinking about is like, I'm sure like as you were starting to do this in terms of like legal or tax or compliance and stuff, you probably made a lot of mistakes at the start and then created a structure or a way to like handle that now. If someone wants to do this, what do some of those like early mistakes look like? And then what is it kind of like team you want to have around you to make sure you don't end up in jail?
Yeah. Well, there's lots of ways to end up in jail, but generally the whole code, it's pretty hard. You know, I'm a big fan of there is no one size fits all in terms of how you construct this stuff, right? Like what you're doing in
Hmm.
particular could be done with an LLC. It could be done with a combination of different stuff. You could own it all by yourself. You could structure stuff in really radically different ways, different states, all that kind of. So there is no one size fits all, which is tough. But the key thing is it's also a one-time thing that you do, right? You're not in a situation where you're trying to like decide every week how you're going to structure a holdco. So the right thing, and the thing I think I was very blessed with was because of coming from a family business and being part of that from the beginning, we had a good set of advisors around us that I basically inherited. Like I didn't have to go find them. But as I worked with my friends and sort of see how they did stuff and sort of see how they built their holdcos and also their individual businesses, sort of understand like the universe of people you want to have around you. So you make the right
Hmm.
decisions on these big one-time, one-way door type decisions. Like how you're going to name your business is actually a big one-way door thing. And you kind of don't want to name it the, Microsoft School of whatever, right? Like it's like they're going to come get you. You can really screw that up. So I
Hmm.
walk people through like this universe of people that you need to hire and you need to have around you. And everybody from a structuring attorney to tax advisors to trademark attorneys to, your CPA, to a CEO peer group. Like these are all people you want to have in your network, kind of a bench people. Because when you're actually running a holdco or starting a business, I think you know this, right? Like it's a very lonely thing. Like there's nobody who's actually a peer
Yes.
for you. Like you can't go to your staff because they don't understand what you're going through because they don't have to make payroll like you do. But all of that comes back down to like surrounding yourself with the right folks, coming up with the idea of what you think is the best way to go about it, and then going back and validating with those people to say, okay, here's what I'm doing. And what I've learned the hard way, and I've done this multiple times, so go to mistakes, like I've cost myself hundreds of thousands of dollars to save $500 in legal fees. Like I've done that multiple times. And it's just like, oh, like, you know what I should have done? I should have found a good advisor and trusted them and like gone through that process. And I talk to folks about like, how do you find the right people to be these advisors? How
Hmm.
do you vet them? How do you determine who you want to work with and who you don't want with? So that's all part of the process of doing here. I wish I could give somebody like a recipe and be like, just do this. But it turns out there are so many moving parts that and they change all the time that it's basically impossible for me to give you a recipe that's always going to be that way that works for everybody.
We're just sort of like where the custom based on the kind of business comes in.
Totally custom based on like for example at your holdco level, right? There are people that are doing holdcos where let's say they own 40% of the business and they've sold 60% of the business to other people. Well, that gets structured in a certain way. How does that get structured based on what sort of entity should you choose based on tax ramifications? Well, tax ramifications depend upon what is the plan to exit the business. Well, when are you going to exit the business? Like what state are you in? Where are the investors from? Like did the people who put the money in, did they come from Canada? Like all those things can start to get very complex very quickly. And I just talked about one permutation, which is at your root thing, like what are all these things that you have to think about? And that's why it's like, it's impossible to like build a course where it's like a choose your own adventure when there's like
Yep.
8,000 different variables. And then let's say you're in a situation where, your holdco is wholly owned by you and you have two subsidiaries and they're going to do business with each other, but they have different ownership groups. Like, how are you going to think through kind of that flow of models? Like, all of those things become very complicated. And that's why, like, A, keeping it simple as a design principle is a really good idea because it's really hard to go back from complexity. And B, where having people that do this all the time, like as tax lawyers and structuring folks, whether it's CPAs or lawyers, like they can help you through that process and make sure you don't like make a nightmare for yourself. Um, so I have an example where like my lawyer saved me 15,000 a year for the next 30 years. Like how much is that worth, right? By doing a little bit of research and coming up with a structure that was going to structure a bunch of holdings in a way that didn't require multiple tax returns. Like that's an enormous deal. Otherwise, we're going to have a
It's
separate
amazing.
bank account and a separate tax return for everything. And so those are the types of things where by like hiring the right person, it can make just a huge difference in terms of how you put stuff together.
I am so excited for your course to come out. One thing I'm curious about is like, let's say someone's operating a business, like I'm operating a business, right? At what point does it make sense to sort of like come to you to like learn this and start the second company maybe in your portfolio or whatever? Like, are there heuristics for that, or would you say like at any point?
It's again, it all ties back to this idea of what do you want to be working on, what gives you
Hmm.
passion, and how does that tie back to the life you want to live. So I think we've built this course for the moment that you're thinking about going to get into your first business, with the idea of using that as a stepping stone to own multiple businesses and kind of being this HoldCo CEO type person. It's also built for people that are on their first company and going to the second one. Like that's totally there. That's totally accessible to them. It's also for people that maybe are at you know two companies and are thinking about, man, this is overwhelming. Like, how do I do it right to get to
Hmm.
five? So all that is part of there. It's just, it really ties back to the moment you think this is the life that you want to be living, like, come give me money. So,
I'm Michael. I'm ready. Tell me where. I've interviewed both Andrew and now you, and I'm like, okay, I'm collecting the what do you call it in Avengers,
the,
the sort of
the
gemstones
Avenger guy,
for all the Holco
uh,
people. Because
Wilkinson, is you talking about Andrew? Yeah.
yeah, because I definitely want to go down this path. I know we only have like 7 minutes left, so I'll end with like the sort of like few questions we always end with, and then we'll drive this to a close. Does that sound good?
Wonderful. Sure.
Cool. Okay. So first one is, what three books have been the most impactful for you and why?
Yeah. So, in terms of books I would recommend to other people, for sure, to other SMB people, Traction and then Top Grading are two I would definitely strongly recommend. There is a great book that I would also recommend, which was The Daily Drucker. I would highly recommend that. It's not one that people talk about very much. So it's Peter Drucker. Do you know who that is?
Hmm.
You heard of him? Yeah.
Yep, management
So,
philosopher.
yeah. So kind of the OG of like management, socialization of kind of those ideas. So anyway, that's a book that rarely gets kind of spread around, but that was really impactful for me to kind of think about, what the job of a manager is and how to manage time. And, I liked the daily aspect where it was like they took
Mhm.
Drucker, it turns out, was this very academic, long writer. So it was very hard to consume his material, but other people paraphrased it down into things that are really good. So, if I had to tell people go read these books, just because I'm somebody that just likes to see impact and that kind of thing, I think those first two, the Top Grading and the EOS book, are ones I would definitely start with. And then Drucker is just one that people don't really think about enough. We don't talk about him enough. I think
Mhm.
he's got some really good things.
Yeah, it's almost like like his teachings are getting lost and we're reinventing them again,
Uh,
basically within
it's
companies and
super
tech and
interesting.
stuff.
Like if I don't know if you've looked at kind of the self-help like idea, like the self-help guru stuff, like you can trace it all the way back, like from Tony Robbins. Like he basically, his book was like, first book was like paraphrased for some ideas from somebody before that. And then that was all paraphrased
Maxwell
from somebody before that.
Maltz.
Yeah. You end up back at whatever his name, Zig Ziglar, or whatever the guy's name was, the Think and Grow Rich
Yep.
guy. Like you just read that one book and like it's everything else just paraphrased over and over.
Definitely,
So
it's like yeah, like Think and Grow Rich, Zig Ziglar, and Maxwell Maltz, who really pioneered this. I'll change this question a little bit. When you're thinking of like Holdco CEOs, who are you inspired by?
of other ones, I
CEOs or
mean, I think,
companies?
yeah. So, there's obviously when people say, Buffett and those guys, Mark Leonard, Constellation, number one,
Hmm.
bad dude. Yeah, dude. And I mean that in the goodest way possible. Like Michael Jackson, bad dude. So that guy, legit, like, having built, a software holding company that is, I guess, like 1/100th the size of what they've built. Like, I just look back in awe around that one. So I think those guys are badasses. He's amazing. The Danaher guys. Are you familiar with them? You heard of
Not.
them? Danaher is one of the kind of the coolest kind of conglomerates, started by a couple brothers back in the 80s, just compounded their way to creating some pretty amazing stuff. They have a whole business operating system that they use throughout all their companies that I think is really, really very cool. The TransDigm guys, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, they just did a really good podcast series on them, serial acquirer of things that were done in terms of buying aerospace manufacturers.
Mhm.
Really, very neat. Yeah, they used to be an operating company that would go in and they would outbid private equity for companies for sale. Like pretty amazing. And then they would run the businesses better than private equity did just because they were such good operators. So really good podcast. A 50x podcast with Will Thorndike. Really, really good. If you want to think about kind of ideas around being a serial acquirer.
And these are all people we can reach out to interview.
Oh, dude, if you get Mark Leonard, good luck. That'd be amazing.
If I get him, I'll email you and be like, Michael, let's do this interview together because I have no idea what to ask him.
Oh my God. Yeah, I'll just be like, oh, Mark, you're so amazing. He doesn't do interviews.
Oh, interesting. He doesn't. Okay. Well, that's going to be a little hard. For you, like, what does it mean to be a conscious creator?
I think we talked about it in the pre-show, right? Like the more I have given back and just give people stuff for free, the more the universe pays me back. Like, so I don't worry about like hoarding knowledge or hoarding insights or any of that kind of stuff. Like we've basically 90% of the course, we've talked about a lot of it. There's the 10% of details you really should hear. So please send me, buddy. I think that's how I think about it, right? It's like just having this trust in the karmic nature of the universe, and like it just continues to pay me over and over again. So that's how I think about it. I'm also happy to hear from you. Anything you think I should be doing better?
No, and that's one of the reasons why I reached out. Right, I think you had posted the Twitter thread that was so insightful. It's like, okay, we got to have this guy on.
Look at this idiot giving away everything.
I don't know if you've seen Matt Mosheri, who's like a CEO coach. So he's coached like.
Is that how you pronounce his name?
Mosheri, right? How do you think of this?
No, I pronounced it Mokari. I've said Mokari like on it. Yeah.
That's actually how I've been saying it too. But then one of the people who worked with us ended up transitioning to his team, and she taught me actually how to say his name. I was like, oh, Mosheri.
Okay.
And it's actually funny. There's a call that we were doing, and she told me like 3 times. I was like, Mokri, Mosheri. How do you say this? And it just took me a while too. And he's just released all of his info, which I think he's doing a great service, similar to what you're doing. And last question, which we can tie back to the course that you're doing. What are you excited about in the next 2 to 3 or 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm loving being on this journey of compounding and building out the HoldCo. I'm still in this phase of life where I'm acquiring and building assets. Maybe I'll get to a point where I start selling them off, but like this is just like doing business like in your late 40s, 50s. Like it's just the best time because you're like old enough to be very experienced and have seen a bunch of things, but like you're young enough to still be energetic, right? And like it's just like super fun. And then along the way, like documenting and teaching, like I just really like it. Like I could do things that pay better than shilling a course. No offense to everybody, but like I just really like doing it. And to some extent, like I've built the course because I like teaching, but B, it's a selection process where I know who I can lean into, and we're like building a community around it, and like people get time with me, and there's like monthly calls and stuff. Like I know the people that are willing to put money into it are taking it seriously, so that helps me take it very seriously with people that are coming in and helping them. And I just like teaching and like doing this stuff. So those 2 things in parallel, like enjoying this teaching thing and then just compounding, super fun.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I learned about courses was if you give a course to someone for free, they're probably not going to watch it. So definitely like charge, because like you said, that becomes a selection process to find the right people to come in.
My course is expensive because it's really good. And that's also a pressure on me. Like I'm like, oh, I'm charging $4,000 for this. It's like, well, okay, like I need to make sure it's really good. And so that's why it's like not come out as quickly as I'd like it to, because I keep wanting to go back and stuff better.
And I'm really excited to just like check it out myself, because I think you're on the cusp of something amazing with showing people a different model to operate companies instead of like just like going all in every day. So if people want to find out about the course, where can they go?
It's super fun. Right now it is holdco.girdley.com. Your idea is to change the the domain sound really fun. But right now it's holdco.curdly.com. And yeah, go there and enter your credit card.
And then I will see you inside the course too. Thank you so much for doing this, Michael. This was a really fun conversation. Anything else you want to leave people with before we end?
Thank you so much. Really fun.